with demand expected to come back, the question remains, does this mean the economy is back on track?
Companies now, after experimenting with offshore in places like India, Philippines, and Poland, want to bring those jobs back.
We invest in the U.S. We're the biggest exporter in the country. In the cycle we're in right now, we're creating jobs.
From Radio America, it's Neal Asbury's Made in America, the show that explores American industry, large and small, and promotes American-made products everywhere. Put Neal Asbury's Made in America to work for you.
A very big welcome to you today. I'm your host, Neal Asbury, together with co-host Dr. Rich Ruffman. So, Rich, with everything going on in the country, and, there's a lot of noise going on, I got to tell you, I'm really optimistic. I think 2019 is going to be a great year. I think it's going to be a good year for our businesses. Somehow I think there's going to be resolution to the trade problems with China. I think when that happens, I think you're going to see the economy really take off. I really do. There's a lot of pent-up demand in this country and in this economy. And if you see some certainty and you can kind of plan for the future, and I believe it's coming, I believe it's around the corner, I think it's going to be great. I think it's going to be great for the American entrepreneur. I think it's going to be great for the American small business, the risk takers, the inventors, those folks out there creating jobs. So, just kind of, let's not all get, sort of anxious here. I really believe there's resolutions to these problems. And I don't believe it's going to take long. I just don't believe it's going to take long. I don't know why, but I'm kind of reading the tea leaves here that 2019 is going to be a great year.
Well, that's very nice. Now, you know what? I tend to agree with you. I think it's going to be a very strange year. I think we're going to see things that we haven't seen in decades happening in Congress, in what the media will do. But I have to tell you, if you really look behind the scenes of what's being presented, all that noise as you're talking about, then I think there's some really good things happening. And I tend to think, I agree with you, that the China-U.S., in quotation marks, trade war is going to have a resolution. And I think when we have this resolution, Neal, I think the markets are going to respond incredibly strong. I absolutely believe it's going to be a phenomenal year if we get that under control. And I absolutely believe that China wants to get it under control as much as we want to get it under control. And if we're going to hold to our points, if we're going to stay strong on this, I think we're going to come out on the winning side.
I really do. And I know there's a lot of noise and, things like the new Green Deal. I mean, you're going to be off fossil fuels in 10 years.
Oh, that's good.
I mean, the largest expansion of government is since the history of the world, if that were to ever happen. Just a lot of stuff. I just don't believe it's gonna pick up any traction. I don't. I think that these are kind of really out there sort of ideas that there's just no support in the mainstream for it.
Well, you know where you'd have support? Here you go again. You will get support on the coasts. You'll get the East Coast. You get the West Coast. They'll support it.
the West Coast.
The West Coast. They'll be toast. Yeah, really. You can tell. It's been the holiday. But with the flyover, the rest of the country not going to buy into it.
Yeah, I don't think so. Hey, but look, talking about the East Coast and the West Coast. Yeah. Let's talk about minimum wage. Minimum wage. Believe it or not, there was 43 minimum wage hikes starting in 2019. Now, 2019 is a couple of days old, and we got 43 wage hikes. We got someone coming on to talk about this. What communities are winning, what communities are losing. Is it good to increase minimum wage? Is it pushing jobs away? Is it attracting jobs? There's just so much dynamic to this. We're very pleased to have with us Michael Saltsman, who's the managing director at the Employment Policy Institute. Michael, welcome to Made in America.
Hey, gentlemen. It's good to be on. Thanks for having me.
So I've read this 43 minimum wage hikes, and it's really not surprising. I mean, if you look at California, so many cities in California now are up at $15 an hour. But they're not to be, Seattle's not to be outdone here. I mean, Seattle's at $16 an hour. And you have, SeaTac, Washington, where the airport is. They're at $16.09 an hour. I mean, it just seems like, you've got these pockets in these communities that are pushing the minimum wage up. But are they doing that at the expense of jobs? I mean, who's winning, who's losing here?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's the important question, I think, about minimum wage, because the policy was, ever since going back to the debate over the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938, the policy has been intended to, raise the lowest paid workers out of poverty. But something that's, I think, economists have figured out along the way is that the minimum wage does not seem to be particularly effective at doing that. There was, for instance, the last time we had a big debate over the federal minimum wage, which I think we're about to have again, there were 28 states that raised their minimum wage in that 4-year period heading up to 2007. And there was a good paper that came out afterwards from economists at Cornell University that found there really wasn't a whole lot of reduction in poverty, both because it was poorly targeted to individuals in poverty, and it also had these kind of negative effects on employment. And so that should, in some ways, should be a really sobering insight for people who support this policy. But what's happened instead over the last couple of years is that the Service Employees Union has spent over $100 million really pushing these local minimum wage increases such that the figure you just mentioned, 43 increases, becomes a reality, where it used to be, tracking minimum wages was a pretty straightforward matter. Now you've got to get into the, kind of the nitty-gritty of local municipal wage laws, because the union has gone town by town to create these mandates that have proved pretty unworkable for a lot of local businesses.
Right, and the unintended consequences, I think, are dire. And the history of this shows that when these increases occur, jobs are lost. I mean, just look in the fast food industry anyway. Look at McDonald's, for example. You go into the modern McDonald's that have all been done over, and you see them, and I rarely go into them except to grab a Coke or something. And they've eliminated so many jobs. They have the boards now that you just hit the buttons, and you get what you want, and you get a number, and you go pick it up, and then that's it. I mean, they don't have people doing anything except basically taking your number and giving you your food. And some of them, the same person who would give you your food walks to a table, as it would be in another type of restaurant, and gives it to you. But the rest of it's gone. They must have eliminated thousands of jobs across the way. And we know when you look at some of the shops that they have in China, they have been experimenting with the ability to eliminate those who work the grill. And it can be done by robotics and AI. So, I tend to think that people really misunderstand the value and the unintended consequences that can occur as a result of demanding and enforcing something that might ultimately be unenforceable.
I think that's right. I mean, there's probably no better example of that point than looking at what's been happening in Seattle in response to the higher minimum wage there. It's been kind of one of these interesting turns of fate, that the city council in Seattle, when they passed 15, they enlisted a group of economists at the University of Washington to study the city's experiment. But when the results started coming back not to their liking, they canceled the contract. And probably the most inconvenient truth for them has been that the workers who were supposed to benefit have, in some cases, either lost income or in other cases on net, have been left where they were before because they received an increase in their base wage, but they lost so many hours at work, either because maybe they're making changes to their schedule, or because automation and technology allow employers to staff less. But they've lost so many hours that the higher base wage is offset, and so they wind up with really no net increase in income. And that should be concerning to Congress, because if a $15 minimum wage has trade-offs in one of the highest wage cities in the country, in Seattle, then what does it mean for St. Louis or for Sioux Falls, or places that have median income that's well below what Seattle has, and presumably. Well,
but that's exactly correct. The common denominator in all the states, if you're going to say, well, every state has to have this level of minimality, and then you realize that the socioeconomics of each different community is, in fact, by virtue of that word, different. And so what works in A doesn't work in B, and certainly may not work in C as a common baseline. So it is a problem. Neil, we covered that study, when it came out a while back. We actually talked about when Seattle was doing that study, and they fired the researchers because it was coming out all wrong. Very interesting you bring that up.
And it seems arbitrary to me. I mean, New York City just increased their minimum wage to $15. You cross the Hudson River, and the minimum wage in New Jersey right now is $8.85 an hour. I mean, it's almost half almost half in New Jersey, and it's across the river. It's a big river, but still, it's a river. It's amazing. And look at in Seattle, $16 an hour, and in Ohio, $8 an hour. Does that mean that the people in Seattle are twice as efficient as those in Ohio? I don't think so. And here's a concept. Maybe it's the regulatory state and all the costs and the social costs and all the boondoggles that these local politicians put on their citizens that they need $15 an hour. But their life and the quality of life at $15 an hour is even worse than people making $8 an hour because you have government bureaucrats wasting their money. And therefore, this is the result. We got to keep increasing minimum wage, not because people are having a better life. It's because we're over-regulating the economy and the people, and this is what it costs, to have, a life that, that they consider minimal. But I think that these city governments really got to take a look at themselves. Hey, Michael, we appreciate you being with us today. Michael Saltsman, Managing Director at the Employment Policy Institute. A very, very important discussion. Thanks for being on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Coming up, Dr. Rothman and I are going to continue this train of thought about how can we create jobs in this country, what do we need to do, what is working and what is not working.
Made in America.
Welcome to Made in America. I'm your host, Neal Asbury, together with co-host Dr. Rich Rothman. So, Rich, let's get back to this. What do we got to do in this country to create jobs? I mean, what's working and what's not working? Well, one of the things that's working in the United States right now and doing very well is the energy segment. And think about it. America now is an exporter of energy. I mean,
it's a great success story. You're right.
And the jobs and what we create, and the wealth that we create in that industry for the people who work in that industry is absolutely phenomenal. I mean, these are not the fast food jobs that, look at this. New York City raises the minimum wage for people working in fast food to $15, right? Because they're not creating any other kind of jobs for these people to have.
Right.
That's the only thing they have.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
So people who are out there creating the good paying jobs, someone's going to say, oh, we can't do that. We can't create these good paying jobs. We can't. We got to just going to legislate unreasonable wages on things that don't add value to the economy and to the world economy. And therefore, the quality of American life is just going to erode and erode and erode and erode. That's not the path to success, Rich.
No, that's exactly correct. And I think it's interesting that you do the comparison. You conflate the two of these things. Fast food industry is one thing, and that's basically it's a low paying. It was never supposed to be carry you for life and raise a family by serving burgers at Burger King or McDonald's.
These were jobs that were meant for our kids.
They were entry level jobs to learn about life. That's what they were originally for.
That's right.
Basically, summer jobs. When kids were looking for jobs in the summer, they went to places like that or whatever. I know I became a lifeguard, but they did that, and I had better food. But having said that, when you look at the jobs that you're talking about in the technology industries, you're looking at the energy industry, these are high-paying, really good jobs that are getting people what we should be getting to raise a family and be part of the American dream. One is actually at the very start of the road of the American dream. And when you're working in a major energy company, like in the Bakken fields in North Dakota, South Dakota, and so forth, that is part of the dream because you're making some serious money. You're going to work hard, but you're making some serious money. And one of the things you said that's really vital is the fact that they are contributing to the growth of the country. In other words, if we become an exporter of energy, we're doing a great thing for this country, aren't we?
I would think.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, you're closing the trade deficit. And look, we got to invest in new sources of energy, and everything evolves and nothing stays still. And that's right. So you create wealth, you create tax revenue, and you can invest that in new sources of energy for the next generation and the next generation. And it keeps getting better and it keeps getting better. But even if you look at the energy industry, the oil and fossil fuel, I mean, it's so much it's so much safer. It's so much better than what it used to be. I mean, when we were growing up, think of the cars that we used to drive. Think of the cars that you would get intoxicated by standing next to one of them. I mean,
that's right.
So, each generation has been able to move forward because why? Because they've created wealth and they've invested that wealth back into new ideas and new technology, and we keep moving forward and we keep making things better. But along the way, you got to create wealth to make a better life.
That's right.
And to create technology, because technology doesn't grow out of nothing. You have to have money to invest.
Well, exactly correct, Neil. You have to have the R&D. You have to do a lot of research and development to understand where you're going, how you're going, how you're going to make it happen, how many people you're going to need, develop the products and services that make that work. It's a process. You cannot, I thought we learned this with Obama's group, you cannot legislate certain things to be done and say it's going to happen. You know what worries me? With all this big green concept that Ocasio-Cortez is having up in New York, and that is that all these great ideas are going to be you know what it is? It's going to be another Solyndra, Neil. They're going to start giving federal money, if they could, to the folks like Solyndra and A123, all these companies that took $570 million and almost $1 billion, and it went right out the window and created nothing ultimately. You can't legislate it. You have to have a free market. And the free market will produce the products and services that are wanted in the free market. And you're very correct. If you create value, if you create equity, and the companies have the funds to do something with it, of course they're going to want to go ahead and create more, whatever it is, product and service that they have. And it takes that equity to be able to do it.
So skipping gears here, talking about the economy and, hey, look, the stock market really took a hammering, at the end of the year.
I'd say that's a good word.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
it's uncertainty. I mean, it's the uncertainty. I mean, uncertainty in the marketplace is not good for anybody. But, here's an interesting headline. U.S. holiday retail sales are strongest in years.
Unbelievable.
But people were spending money.
Well, Neil,
people were spending money.
That dovetails exactly. They had more holiday travel than they've had in decades in this last holiday. Why do you suppose that is? You just said it, so I'm being rhetorical. But the fact of the matter is, if they have more money and they're traveling and more people, that costs money, doesn't it? So you have to be able to finance your travel. If they're buying more and more products, and particularly on the Amazons of the world, did spectacular this year. That means, what does that mean? It means people are making more, they have more, they're more secure in what they're doing. Isn't that a good thing?
Talking about Amazon, what did they make an announcement this week? That they're going to hire 25,000 veterans to work at their new headquarters in the Washington,
From the
DC
desk
area.
of David Brim.
Yes.
From the desk of David Brim up in Chicago. Yes, they're going to do that.
There's some success.
Well, I think that's terrific. We've talked about this. We've advocated this. Veterans, great employees to have. Great employees. I applaud.
Hey, we got to get back to that. We got to get back to that thought. But hey, we're going to take a quick break. But we're coming back with Jarret Skroup, who's the marketing director at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. He's going to talk about regulation and what Michigan is doing about regulation. This is actually a very good story. You don't want to miss this.
Made in America.
Sharply higher at the open, stocks continued to perform well over the course of the day Tuesday.
And I think that bodes well here over the next couple of years for having bigger demands coming to this country.
Now, more of Neal Asbury's Made in America.
A very big welcome to you today. I'm your host, Neal Asbury, together with co-host Dr. Rich Rothman. So, Rich, just talked a moment ago about regulation and how regulation adds a lot of cost. And I'm not saying that all regulation is bad regulation, but regulation does tend to get out of control. And then you have, federal regulation, you have state regulation, then you have all the local regulation, and then you have all the licensing. You just want to practice your trade, and you get a state license, but it's not good for the city that you're living in. So how much licensing do we need? And then you talk about our veterans and our military, and you're hearing this, is that they're coming back home, right? And they got all of this great education from the military, and they can do all sorts of things, but they come back home and then they got to, kind of go ahead and get educated so they can get some certificate to be able to do whatever they just learned the American taxpayer paying for.
Right.
But yet that's not good enough.
No.
You could run the greatest military in the world, and you could keep it running and serviced and, ready to go at a moment's notice. But you can't come back and be a plumber in Lansing, Michigan, right? Or wherever. Pick a town in America because you're not licensed. So I think this country's missing a great deal. I think it's adding a lot of cost. And I think that's one of the reasons why people are having this minimum wage conversation, because regulation just adds so much cost. Licensing adds so much cost that if we just got everything at the best price, at the right value, people would live a better life.
Well, I tend to agree with you. And we know one of the reasons the economy took off the way it did is that, President Trump eliminated so many rules and regulations that made it onerous for a business to either start up or stay in business. And then you have the taxation situation. We had a high corporate tax. So we changed that. But a lot of the optimism occurred when we eliminated a lot of the overregulation that existed. So I'm very anxious to hear what's going on in Michigan. This should be interesting.
We're very pleased to have with Jarret Skroup, who's the marketing director at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy in Michigan. Jarret, welcome to Made in America.
Hey, guys. Thanks for having me.
So it looks like the state of Michigan is saying, hey, wait a second, we don't need all this licensing. We don't need all this regulation. The local communities are not, able to overstep their boundaries by making it more difficult to work. If someone's got a state-recognized license, they should be able to work in the state of Michigan. It seems pretty logical to me, but that was something that they had to deal with, on the legislation side?
Sure, yeah, that's absolutely right. So you guys hit the nail on the head in this in a lot of ways. This kind of started in Michigan. Our governor, now outgoing governor, who just left, Rick Snyder, when he came into office, he had read a report on occupational licensing, which nobody really knew what that meant, but he was kind of a nerdy guy and dug into it, and he said, this seems like it's a big problem. And in Michigan, like most states, we have, over the last couple of decades, just rapidly increased the number of jobs that required a license. And when we say a license, we mean mandated educational hours, mandated fees, continuing education, testing, things like that. And if you go back 40, 50 years, there were some jobs that were licensed, but they tended to be really high educated jobs, lawyers, doctors, some health professions, barbers, for kind of randomly, I think. But over about 30 years ago, you just had this huge increase in these other types of jobs, kind of lower paid jobs sometimes, or jobs that were more blue collar people could do coming out of high school, plumbers and electricians and roofers and painters and things like that, cosmetologists. And so our governor came in and he commissioned a report to review the licenses on the books, and we've kind of slowly repealed some of those licenses and some of the rules. And then the most recent issue we had here in Michigan was we began preventing local governments from licensing their own areas. We had a big problem. We had local governments licensing batting cage operators and window washers, movers and gardeners and things like that. And I thought that was kind of insane, so we were happy to push that legislation.
Well, let me ask you a question. So what would be the downside? I mean, what's the comeback on this for people who are against it, if they are against it?
Because you have a new governor coming in now, right? You have Snyder was a Republican, and now you got a Democrat coming in as governor. Will they change it? Try to change it back to be a more regulated process?
They might, but I can say here in Michigan, we actually we worked together on some of these licensing reform laws with our state ACLU branch. They got on board because they saw that this mostly was affecting lower income people. And then one area that we haven't even mentioned yet, which is the vast majority of licensing laws prevents people with a criminal background from getting licensed. And, I can certainly understand that there are some areas, there's some occupations where maybe somebody, if they were a drug dealer, maybe shouldn't have access to drugs or something along those lines. But if you made a mistake, you have a marijuana arrest when you were 18, 19 year old, are you saying that person can't go become a roofer later in life? And so we were working with the ACLU and one of our more liberal think tanks here in the state to support some laws that would kind of crack back against some of those and allow people to have a path to second chances. So I'm hopeful, even though we do have a Democratic governor now, that we'll be able to continue those relationships and continue to get rid of still more of these kind of needless laws and fight back against any attempt to turn that back.
So briefly, how does this work? That let's say you move to the state of Michigan and you want to become an electrician. So there's a board that you apply to in the Capitol, and that they issue your certificate. How would that function? What's in real time?
Yeah, so there's a big licensing agency, and most occupations are governed by a board that is made up of people that are participants in that occupation. And then you would apply for it. So most of them online, it'll say, here's the number of training hours you need to do, here's the school you need to attend, here's how much fees you have to do up front, here's the tests you need to pass, and you have to go through with that process. And including I make a point that some of these most of them are totally arbitrary. I mean, they're just whatever the occupation could get passed when it did get passed. So, for example, to wash hair in the state of Michigan, you have to do 1,500 hours of education, which what does 1,500 hours mean? So that's more than to be an attorney in the state of Michigan. It's 20 times as much training hours to wash hair in the state or to whiten teeth than it is to be an auto mechanic in the state of Michigan. So you just have these rules that don't make any sense. They're big obstacles in front of people. And, yeah, you have to go through the process, apply through the state, and be approved by the board.
And it adds a lot of costs, too, to the consumer. Hey, we've been listening to Jarret Skroup, who's the marketing director at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, and some good news out of Michigan. I'm glad to see that they're turning back their regulatory state, at least for now. Hey, Jarret, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys.
Coming up, we have Dr. Jean-Pierre Isbouts, and he's going to talk about his film, which is currently on Netflix, called Walt, about Walt Disney, and it was actually commissioned by the Disney family as well as the Disney company. And he was given incredible access to the archives. But let's talk about Walt Disney as the entrepreneur, as the job creator. You don't want to miss this.
Made in America.
Welcome to Made in America. I'm your host, Neal Asbury, and we've got a really, really special guest with us right now. We're very pleased to have with us Dr. Jean-Pierre Isbouts, a very, very successful author, 12 books for National Geographic, and a historian on the Holy Land, but also a film director, a film writer, and producer. And the Disney company and the Disney family was looking for someone to tell the story of its founder, Walt Disney, and who would be a very honest voice about Walt and his work and his relationships with his employees, the creative side, the entrepreneurial side. And they hired Jean-Pierre to do that. In the movie that he produced, Walt, the man behind the myth, you can see it now on Netflix. You know, Walt was fired by his first editor because he lacked imagination. He went to more than 100 banks before he found anyone that would loan him money for Disney World. I mean, the guy was relentless. He was a visionary, but he was an entrepreneur. And as an entrepreneur, he is an amazing man. I mean, he was just so persistent. And that's what entrepreneurialism is all about, is never giving up, never giving, you're going to have your downs and they're going to beat you up, but just get yourself back up, dust yourself off and get right back into the game. But the way he treated his people, and his people were loyal to him, and they stayed with him for many, many years. And he had this really great team of people that wow, look at what they produced. An absolute incredible American story. Jean-Pierre is here with us right now. Jean-Pierre, so when you worked on this documentary and had access to all this information and all his ex-employees, what did you see there? I mean, we all talk about the creative side of Walt Disney. How about the entrepreneurial side of Walt Disney and how he created his empire and his business and his relation with his employees? I mean, there was a whole lot going on to keep that together.
Absolutely, Neal, and that's one of the myths that we were trying to get through with this film. We started this film many years ago when many of the collaborators that worked on Snow White and all these wonderful classics were still alive. And that was the myth that we were going for. What is it that motivated this man to come up with these incredible ideas? Here's a very simple man from the Midwest. He's not very educated. He doesn't have a formal education, doesn't have a formal education as a draftsman, and yet he has these brilliant ideas and has the drive to make them happen. And of course, he couldn't do that by himself. So what made him motivate his employees to have this tremendous loyalty to them? And I think it's...
Did they fear him? Did they fear him? Did they... what kept it together? Was he tough? Was he a real tough guy?
Very tough.
Perfectionist? I mean, was he really driving for perfection? He knew what he wanted.
He knew what he wanted. This is a great story about the sweat box. The sweat box was the screening room, and whenever the narrator, an animator, finished a piece of line art animation for a picture, it would be screened in the in the sweat box. Walt would come in, gruff, sit down, and then he would have his comments, and he would walk out, and he would never praise you to his face. He would never praise you to your face. And what he would do, though, is tell other people about the great work you were doing. He thought that's how he created loyalty among his people. It's one thing to tell you, fine job. It's quite another to turn to others and say, John, look at what John did. Look at what Tom did. Look what Mary did. That is fine work. I think that's part of that myth of how he created this incredible loyalty.
Was it for him? Was it about wealth creation, or was it about the art?
He couldn't care less about money, quite frankly. I mean, imagine today any president of a major Hollywood studio mortgaging his own house to finance a picture, right? It would be crazy. And yet that's what he did. That's what he did for Snow White. He was prepared to do that when he wanted to build Disneyland. He was prepared to put his own home, his own finances on the line to see it happen. So strong was that drive to see these creative ideas realized.
Right, and you talk about the entrepreneurialism. I mean, he was the ultimate entrepreneur.
Absolutely,
he created it out of nothing.
But I must give credit to Roy, because
his
brother Roy,
his younger brother, right?
He was older.
Oh, Roy was older.
Walt was slightly younger than Roy, and Roy made it happen. Walt had the ideas, the creativity, and Roy made the finances happen. And sometimes there was tension, but it was that unique duo that created the Walt Disney Brothers Studio.
Was his wife involved?
His wife was not that much involved. She was the homemaker. She stayed at home. She raised their two daughters.
Like the Midwest family.
Yes, exactly. She was born in Lewiston, Idaho. She was a very solid, very dependable homemaker, and she was comfortable. She was not comfortable in the Hollywood scene like we would have today.
And did she live much longer from Walt?
Yes, she did. She lived much longer than Walt, and really kept his dream alive. And of course, Diane, their daughter, is who initiated this film. I mean, she's the one who said, "I want to see a film that really explains the unique creative genius that my father was, not only as a creative genius, but also as a father, as a husband, as a man." And that's what we try to do.
Jean-Pierre, excellent. You can see it on Netflix. Walt, the man behind the myth, and the man behind Walt, the man behind the myth, has just spoke to us. Dr. Jean-Pierre Isbouts, an incredible author, film writer, director, and producer. We're so happy to have you with us. And by the way, Jean-Pierre, I look forward to collaborating together with you on our book together, The Discovery of the Americas and the Founding of the United States. It's going to be out soon. You don't want to miss that either. Coming up, Dr. Rothman and I are going to have a few final thoughts for the day.
Made in America.
Welcome to Made in America. I'm your host, Neal Asbury, together with co-host Dr. Rich Rothman. Hey, Rich, Jean-Pierre Isbouts, I mean, he's done a lot of work, too, with Charlton Heston. He's done a lot of documentary work. And that's another fascinating American.
Well, there's this connection to the Bible.
Oh, there you go.
I mean, that's a dead giveaway. Yeah, I mean, seriously. You want to talk about ancient history? He's the guy.
Jean-Pierre was telling me last night that Charlton Heston told him he lived in a beautiful home in of course, right? Well, he says it was the home that Ben-Hur built. I guess that really launched him big time financially. But, he was a very spiritual guy. And, his acting out the Bible and all of that was very, very important to him. And he wanted to document that and pull all of that together. And he hired Jean-Pierre to come in and write it for him, direct it, and produce it. Very, very fascinating. So also very important work from Jean-Pierre. But the writing that he's done, the books that he's published, especially on the Holy Land, his film on the finding of the lost Last Supper. Believe it or not, there was a lost Last Supper that he found and authenticated, and it became huge news throughout Europe. He's kind of like the biblical Indiana Jones in finding all these lost documents and what he's done in the Holy Land and all of that. A great American.
American. I'm just wondering, because I read about this from our friend Peter Miller. So the lost Last Supper, and I defy anyone to say that 3 times fast. The lost Last Supper. Now, what was missing in the other one? I mean, are there waiters in this one?
There was actually a second version of the Last Supper that was commissioned by the King of France. And Jean-Pierre, do you want to comment on that?
Sure.
Yeah, maybe let's just get Jean-Pierre. There was actually a lost Last Supper.
Well, the reason why the lost Last Supper is so important because the original Last Supper fresco, which is, of course, in Milan, many of us have seen it, is so destroyed that we can only see 20% of it. Leonardo used a very weird mixture of oil paints, and everybody who's ever painted their bathroom wall knows that you can't mix oil paint with oil paint. And so the fresco started to deteriorate within months. And today we can only see 20% of what Leonardo meant. And that's why this second copy is so important, because when I saw it for the first time in his remote monastery in Belgium, all of a sudden I saw what Leonardo really intended.
Incredible. And it was lost. Did they know what it was?
Well, the monks knew it was there, of course. It's been there for 450 years in that monastery.
But they know what it was?
They thought it was an anonymous copy. They had no idea that it was actually done by Leonardo's workshop. And then, in fact, 2 figures in this painting were painted by Leonardo himself.
And why is this not more known?
Well, that's what we tried to do with the film. That's why we produced the film. And we've had great success in Europe with headlines in many of the media.
So when you found this, I mean, it was a really big deal in Belgium, and
it was. We had, the next day after we premiered the film, all of the major news media and television had headlines about this discovery. They're delighted to have it. Of course, do they have the finances to maintain it? And that's the other part. And so we're helping the monastery to raise money to maintain this 500-year-old painting.
And it was commissioned by the King of France.
That's right. We found evidence that this painting was commissioned by King Louis XII, who first, believe it or not, wanted to take the wall of the fresco down. And of course, his architect said, and engineer said, you can't take a wall across the Alps on donkeys. It's not going to work. We can't do it. And of course, kings are not, used to being told no. So he opted for the second best thing, and that's a copy.
And so he commissioned it.
He commissioned a copy.
And how did it end up in Belgium?
It first went to France as commissioned. It wound up in a palace that we've tracked down. It's in the film. And from there, unfortunately, Louis XII died. And it wound up in the inventory. It was put on for sale. And lo and behold, there was a monastery just then built who wanted to have a large painting of the Last Supper. And they went to Paris and bought it.
Well, there you go. So, Rich, what do you think about that story?
How do you top that? We've gone from Charlton Heston parting the Red Sea to a 450-year-old fresco.
Last Supper.
Yeah, Last Supper.
I don't think a lot of people know that. I mean, about that there was actually a second one. Everybody knows the first one. Hey, Rich, it was a really fun show today. Great way to start the year. But unfortunately, we're out of time.
Always.
But we're going to be back again next week for another adventure of Made in America, where we never stop fighting for your jobs.